Next up is Tao Jin, another youth speaker, to present to us.
Thank you all for being here, and I am also I'm not sure if he introduced himself, but I'm also a classmate with Eric. And today, at the start of the presentations, there's a lot of talk about government and policy, but I want to talk about what individuals can do and they can do it together to achieve change. So I want to discuss on how to live a low carbon lifestyle. So let's start off with some background information. So this is a chart of the CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and industry. So this is not quite consumers yet. And you can see that Canada, surprisingly, is among the worst emitters. Now, you can look around and see blue skies and no pollutions, and you might think, well, Canada's doing pretty well in terms of climate and emissions, but according to the statistics from 2022, we still aren't really doing that well. In fact, out of all the countries here that have the major countries here, you can see that Canada is the third worst. And if you look to the right a little bit, you will see the world average, which is about 4.7 tons, and you can see that Canada is pretty much 3 times the world average. So Canada is not actually doing that well in industry. Now, what about lifestyle? So you can see that we have about around 14 tons of carbon emissions per capita in terms of lifestyle, and you can further break that down into this pie chart here, and you can see that the 3 most biggest emissions by these categories is in transportation, housing, and consumer goods, which consumer goods Eric just talked about. So I would like to talk about here, starting with transportation. Okay, so no surprise, transportation, you can see that cars in general emit the most amount of carbon dioxide. And next up is airplanes. So using some online sources, I approximated about how much carbon is emitted per 1,000 kilometers. You can see that by car, again, is the most, about 320 kilograms of carbon dioxide every 1,000 kilometers. And next, airplanes, 280. But you can see that by train and by bus and electric buses, it's insignificant. It's almost nothing. So here we can see that we can take public transportation like trains and buses to reduce our carbon footprint. And moving on to housing. So housing is actually, there's a better term for what's happening here. It's actually just energy, right? Because at home, the most amount of carbon emissions emitted is by using energy like electricity, natural gas, that type of stuff. So you can see that electricity and other energy accounts for the 2 most emissions here per capita. And although construction, it does emit carbon, like for example, making concrete, it's not as much and it's not continuous because you build a house and that's it. But like electricity, gas stoves, you gotta keep on using them every day, right? And now I'm estimating about every $100 of electricity used, it emits about 120 kilograms of carbon. And for natural gas, it emits about 10 times more, way more, about 1,100 kilograms. So there still might be people using, I think there's still a lot of people using natural gas heating at home, and this is the change that we can make. We can change to electric heating pumps so that we can have that 10 times less carbon emissions. Okay. And now moving on to food. So who here loves meat? Meat? Yeah, a lot of people like meat, right? So now meat is incredibly hard to produce. You gotta think about taking care of the livestock for many years, right? And the livestock, they have to get water, they have to get food, right? And like, for example, beef, they emit a lot of methane as well, right? So these also contribute to emissions. And of course, that means that meat and dairy emit a lot of carbon. And here I estimate about every kilogram of beef or lamb, there's about 15 to 30 kilograms of carbon emissions. Now, for fish or poultry, every kilogram emits about 1 to 6 kilograms. So, but here's the thing. We all like meat, right? So we can't realistically give up meat, right? So from time to time, you can eat meat, but there are better alternatives for the protein that you want to get from meat. For example, fish and poultry. And in addition to meat, as I think Eric mentioned, transportation of goods, right? These things also, transportation, again, I've said earlier, emits a lot of carbon, right? So buying seasonal food, buying locally produced foods cuts down on that transportation emissions. And of course, decreasing the amount of beverages and snacks you eat per day also decreases carbon emissions, because look at this, for example. It's plastic, right? You use oil to make these things. And unfortunately, we got a lot of plastic back there. So that's a lot of carbon emissions. So by cutting down on these packaged products at home, you can reduce a ton, I think half a ton of carbon emissions. And buying seasonal foods also decreases the use of energy needed to produce food all year round. So that will also decrease carbon emissions. So putting all these things together, we have 3 lifestyle scenarios that we can choose from. So we have our control case, which is the usual, what people who don't hear about climate initiatives would do. They would use gasoline cars, about 15,000 kilometers per year, 1 intercontinental air travel per year. Housing, they have about 150 square meters, and they eat the average amount of food, which includes meat, dairy, veggie, fruits, and beverage, and about 1,500 monthly goods and services used. And you can see for the base case, there's about 14.7 kilograms of carbon emitted per capita. Now, let's move on to scenario number 1, low carbon scenario number 1. So in this case, we switch our transportation method to electric vehicles and local transport, and reduce about our mileage to about 20%, reduce mileage by 20%. And we still do intercontinental air travel, but it's now every other year. And we switch house heating over to heat pumps, and the rest remains unchanged. And now you can see that the emissions have gone almost gone down by half to 8.5 kilograms. So that's a pretty good change. And now finally, we can go even further with lifestyle scenario number 2, which is the same as the scenario number 1, but we also adjust our diet to switch 50% of our beef and lamb to fish and meat alternatives. So we also reduce our dairy consumption by half, and we don't take beverages and snacks. So that will further reduce the emissions by 1 kilogram. So honestly, for me, making change in my lifestyle is going to be kind of difficult. So I advocate that everyone try scenario number 1, or of course, these are just scenarios, right? You can modify the scenarios to fit your own needs. So I'm advocating that you change your lifestyle so that you can slowly adjust to that change while also reducing your carbon emissions. And maybe one day you might also go for life scenario number 2 if you think that's a good idea for you. Now, you can see here that there's still emissions, right? It's still a positive number. So further, this is kind of cliche now, but of course you could plant trees to reduce your emissions. So here's a statistic. So on average, a mature tree can absorb about 167 kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. So you can see here that this takes out almost, I think, 10 times a bit more of your lifestyle, of our base case. But of course, a tree's carbon absorbing capacity differs depending on what type of tree it is, like its species, age, size, and where you plant it, like weather conditions and type of soil. So honestly, planting more trees does help. And if you change your lifestyle as well, that will also make reduce carbon emissions by a lot. So, are we ready for a low carbon lifestyle? And any questions? No question. Yep, Ted.
Did you account that when you produce the fertilizer, you make the plant-based food, the production of fertilizer also produces CO2, like all the greenhouse gases?
Yes, and that's the thing. For my presentation parts, I'm mainly talking about the consumer side. So, of course, yes. And also for my sources, each of them, they differ in what they account for. You could choose, like you could look at the scope that they, I guess they calculate. So like they include for the calculations. So it really depends. For the numbers, it really depends on what those scope includes. So I'm not exactly sure, but of course that fertilizer, I think it's not that avoidable because you don't really have the choice for that. So I think that doing these things yourself would help.
The question here is actually built in the methodology. And you will see that there's a lot of research on the website. There's a lot of there's a different publication. And there's the question you ask is really in the scenario. But to be honest, what you're using is just an online tool to key in the data. But how they calculate decline, I don't think you know this.
Yeah.
It should be counted. It should be counted.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay, I think that is it for my presentation. Thank you for listening.